there's a cost to inviting people into change and renewal and transformation. And it can be a very significant cost because most of us, including me, like we're really good at maintaining the status quo, and that's where we want to be, because it hurts a lot for things to be different, because it usually asks something of us that most of us don't want to give. The reality is, the status quo has to become more painful than the change we're being invited into before we choose the change.
You're listening to the Liminal Living podcast, a resource of practices and perspectives for those in dark nights and deconstruction.
Well, David, you are like a dear friend of mine and have been for how long now?
Oof,
Yeah.
just a few years, 4 or 5 years, something like that.
The pandemic makes everything seem like it was a long time ago. It seems like we've been friends forever, but I met you at a mutual friends. He invited us to Starbucks in Mount Pleasant, Jason Rates, which he's going to be on the podcast pretty soon too. But that was where I met you, and I think that was somewhere around I was there for 2015 to 2018, so it has to be in that realm. 2015 to 2018, somewhere in there.
Yeah, right.
So we're going on almost 6 years probably.
That's right.
That's crazy. See, the pandemic just makes everything all like, when was that? I don't even know. There's like BC and AD, and now there's like pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and it's weird.
Our friendship is officially in kindergarten.
It's in kindergarten. Oh, that's nice. Time for a nap.
Seriously.
So when we met, you were pastoring at a church up in Higgins Lake area in Michigan.
Yep.
And that was an American Baptist church. And how long were you there, and what was that like?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for the chat and the invitation to talk. So I started at the church where I was. I started there in 2014. My title was lead pastor, even though I was the only pastor on staff. So, held on to that title for my ego. Lead pastor. And a little bit of the context is that it's a blue collar rural community, sort of a summer resort area in Michigan. So if you're from the upper Midwest, you know this, but if anyone is listening that's not, we call the northern part of our state, sort of in air quotes, up north. I'm going up north for the weekend.
Yeah.
So
is there an official, is like their official line that you cross and now you're officially up north? Or is it like...
I might say north of Mount Pleasant, but I don't know. Up north is in your heart.
It's in your heart. Yeah.
Put that on a t-shirt.
Okay.
So I started in 2014. A couple of things that are important about this story. I was 32 at the time when I started. I'd never been a senior or a lead pastor. Been a pastor, different roles in different size churches throughout the year. Youth pastor, discipleship, worship leader. And then the other piece of info is that I came to a church that's over 100 years old, and I followed a pastor who was retiring after 33 years in that role.
Wow.
So he retired Easter 2014, and I started, I want to say it was like 2 or 3 weeks. It was pretty, it wasn't even a month. I think I started 2 weeks after he officially retired. And so what I stepped into, which I didn't know at the time, was a relatively small rural church community that was in the thick of grief from losing their longtime pastor. But they didn't have any language or imagination or theology of grief to know that that's where they were. What they'd been told by the outgoing pastor. Some variation of, isn't it amazing what God is doing? Bringing us a great young pastor with a cute family. And there's nothing but good things in the future for our church. And there's some truth to that story, but it's certainly not the full story. And so it took me almost a year to kind of begin to really understand what was happening. And what was happening is that people were grieving. And so I spent time tending to my own grief, my own life, which helped me tend to the grief of this community. And what that means practically is that we worked through a lot of sort of language around grief and lament. We worked through a lot of imagination for what that looks like in the life of faith. And in some ways, I tried to help people develop a theology of grief, that grief and loss are just a normal part of life, they're a part of being alive, and they play a pretty prominent role in the life of faith. They're just not a particularly American sort of value. Kind of like everything's always kind of up and to the right, best days are ahead, the best is yet to come. And it's not that there isn't any truth to any of that, but it teaches people that when bad things happen and when we suffer and when we're grieving, that somehow is outside of what God is inviting us into.
You said that you were grieving, you're learning how to grieve yourself. Was there something specific that you were grieving, or was it just like an underlying feeling that you were having at the moment? Your grief was teaching them to grieve.
I think both. The very specific thing that happened is 5-6 months after I started, my dad passed away suddenly.
Oh, wow.
And so I had to figure out how to pastor when I just didn't really even know how to like grieve the loss of my dad. And I remember feeling, even at his funeral, my parents live in Tennessee, so we drove down. Just sort of feeling in some ways, the funeral was very typical of kind of an evangelical tradition, just to say it was very positive and upbeat. And I did not feel positive personally. So I didn't know how to articulate this. I just knew that like something here just isn't fitting. Something isn't sitting. There's nothing about this tragedy that feels positive or good to me. There is no language, and there is no kind of cliche about God working in the world that it remotely makes this better or eases the pain that I feel. Mm-hmm. Like the reality is my dad died and I didn't want it to happen. Wish it didn't happen. Not okay with it. And it feels so like cruelly final. So I found myself leading a congregation that really wanted to sort of see growth and change and renewal. But I had absolutely no clue, and I would put myself in the same place around what it actually costs to grow and change it. Mm-hmm. I came to see over the years that I think some of this is sort of, the capital W West, but aversion to suffering, and just sort of this myth that if we do the right things, then God will spare us from suffering. I think that's sort of the basic theology that I inherited from my tradition.
So you're like grieving the loss of your dad, and you're starting into this church that they have laid down this expectation of there's no reason for grief. Not even there's no room for grief. Like there's no reason for it because God is good and we have a new pastor and I've finished a great season and we're just off at the races, trying like not to skip a beat. Because you can't pause and take a moment to feel anything negative. And I think that theology of, like, you know, if you, like you said, if you do all of the right things, then God is going to just rain all of the blessings down. And this comes from, it almost feels like an emotional prosperity gospel, right? Like, it's not just like, we'll rain finances down on you. We'll scoff at that, you know. We'll look at those big mega churches with the pastors in the fancy suits asking for all the money while they fly off, and we're like, oh, that's a bunch of hogwash. But we've bought into like this emotional prosperity gospel where if you just do everything right, everything goes well. And then when you run into a season of your life where you got to actually grieve something, like, there's just no place for that there's no time for that. There's no place for that in the church. And then you like feel like, well, what did I do wrong? Everyone else seems to be getting along just fine. How did you create that space in order to experience the grief, not just to justify its need, but just to like say that it's even there and that it's real? Like, how did you bring that to their attention?
That's a really good question. I'm sure I did it really poorly, but
there's only one way to do it, and that's just do it.
Yeah. I mean, simultaneously through all of this, probably the most kind of presenting issue in our church was that we had been declining and contracting in every measurable metric for about 15 years. And so I was explicitly hired to change that. That's what I was asked to do. And how that was communicated to me was that I sort of had free reign to kind of reconfigure things in order to try to become more hospitable to people who were a bit younger than what our church had become. In hindsight, looking back, I would guess there were, I don't know, 10 to 20% of the people of our church at the time who were really excited about things changing in order to just be a more welcoming and hospitable community for people who are outside of our church. What I sort of crashed into without expecting it was that the majority of the people who call our church home they were perfectly happy with how things were, which is why they called our church home.
Yeah.
They didn't see any reason for anything really to change. And the way I've come to see it and talk about it, it's that I think it's such a normal human experience. We all really, like, we deeply desire the results of change, but we don't want to do the work of change, myself included.
Yeah.
For example, there are many adults in America that want to lose some weight. And so the desire for that is there. But to actually do the work of losing weight is so much more painful and elusive than just holding that desire. And it's the same in churches. It's the same in pretty much any organization, that we all like, everyone is for change until you are asked to change. So when it stopped becoming a theory, and when it stopped being a theory and started to become a reality, and people were asked to sort of go along with how things were changing, that's when, I mean, in some ways, that's when sort of all hell broke loose. Because you're dealing with sort of these fundamental core values that people inhabit that often they don't even realize they inhabit. There was a guy in our church who was he was a bully, is really what he was. He was mean. He treated people poorly, except sometimes he didn't. He had a big heart for hurting and sort of marginalized people in our broader community, and was known to be very generous with people. But for the most part, in our church, the way that he functioned was sort of a loner off to the side, leaning against the wall of a room, never befriending or interacting with people, keeping to himself, and overall just kind of being a jerk toward most people. And I think particularly in small communities, we all just learn to tolerate bad behavior so as to sort of keep the community together. So over decades, this guy's really bad behavior had been tolerated. And so when the bad behavior inevitably came my way, when he started acting out in different ways, when he co-opted our corporate prayers of the people time to read a pre-written prayer that was just a litany of complaints against me as the new pastor.
Oh, wow.
When he wrote vaguely threatening letters about who I was and me as a new pastor, mentioning how many guns he has, that was very terrifying. When he started to do all these things, and I didn't just go along, he kept kind of upping the ante, and acting out more and more egregious ways. And so eventually it was scary enough that we got the local authorities involved, and he was arrested on a Sunday morning when we asked him to stay away for a while we figured out what in the world to do about his behavior. Because over the years, what he had been unintentionally or intentionally communicated to him was that he could behave in any way that he wanted to, and that was okay, that he was a part of the group, and that it was more important to the group that he felt connected than everyone felt safe. And so when I wouldn't go along with that, he sort of lost his mind. When I said, no, there's actually ways that everyone's expected to treat everyone else, that we have boundaries around our relationships. We don't let people push us around. No, you can't actually speak that way to people in our church. That's inappropriate and rude and just mean. That's not how we treat people here. So when I began to set boundaries, it was really difficult for him. No one had done that with him in the context of our church. People had done that with him in the context of other parts of his life, but no one had done that with him in our church. And so I then became, all of his anger and frustration in life was then zeroed in on me. There's a cost to inviting people into change and renewal and transformation. And it can be a very significant cost, because most of us, including me, we're really good at maintaining the status quo, and that's where we want to be, because it hurts a lot for things to be different, because it usually asks something of us that most of us don't want to give. And the reality is the status quo has to become more painful than the change we're being invited into before we choose the change. And as long as the status quo is more comfortable, we will always choose the more comfortable path. So what I was doing as a pastor when it comes to inviting people into grief and loss is I was really inviting them into change. But the reality is change is always grief and loss. The two go hand in hand. There's sort of two sides of the same coin. So at least in my context in pastoral leadership, to lead change faithfully, you're actually leading people into grief and loss, which human beings inherently resist. And so even as I'm saying this out loud, I'm just like, that sounds like a horrible time.
What a job description.
I know, right? And in hindsight, there were many, many periods of it that were horrible. It wasn't particularly pleasant. To put it in a really crude way, in the context of pastoral ministry, I had a coach I worked with for a while early on who would say, David, he had a thick Kentucky accent. He'd say, David, it's easier to have a baby than raise somebody from the dead.
Yeah.
What he was saying is there's a reason why 32-year-olds go and plant churches, brand new churches, rather than try to bring some sense of revitalization to 100-year-old churches, because it's easier to have a baby than raise someone from the dead.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. I was actually I tried to do the church planting community for a while, and I found out I didn't fit in it. But I learned a lot about it. And I remember going to like the exponential conference, the big, huge, like 5,000 church planters in one room conference. It's like the thing. And I'm looking around, and like one of the speakers from the stage had made a joke about how we're all just youth pastors that got kicked out of our churches. So we decided to go plant one anyways. And everybody was like cracking up. I'm like, wait, that's not a joke. Like, that's true. These are all like people who were like in a church and in some form of a staff position, and they couldn't get the thing to change. So then they just like, I'm going to go do my own thing. I was just like, wow, that's actually true. So you have this like job description now to lead people into grief and loss where there has been no room for it, no place for it, no acknowledgement of it. And it kind of like burned you in that story of that man. So then you stayed there from 2014 to just, was it last year?
2022. So 8 years.
8 years.
Yeah. And in effect, and again, the way that I make sense of it now, and even while I was still in the role, is I became sort of the interim pastor or the midwife, if we want to use that phrase, for this church that they had refused to have after the retirement of their long-serving 33-year pastor.
Yeah.
So by default, I sort of became that interim, which, some systems require an interim between pastors or, strongly recommend it. To this day, everyone that I meet in pastoral ministry, when I tell them I followed a pastor that was there for 33 years, I mean, the reaction is literally the same to every pastor I meet. And that reaction is usually some form of like shaking their head, some form of like sigh, like, like, it's like everybody knows. And one of the big questions I have is like, why didn't anyone know when I was saying yes to this? Like, why didn't anyone know? Why didn't I know?
I remember visiting your community. I spoke there. I think it was 2019, because it was right before I took the position that I hold now at the Congregational Church here. In February, you invited me out, and I spoke. And I was really, because you told me where the church had been, and I was really impressed with the culture that you were able to craft, like just the church culture. It felt like this is a very different church than the one that was described by you. And this was, 5 years in at this point. And I was just really impressed by the culture that you crafted at that church and how you changed things. And I would say that you were a really good leader for that church for that time, and you helped them change. But then things started to change within you and kind of around you, and you started to like not fit so well anymore. And I mean, we accompanied each other on this path of you ended up leaving. What's the long story about how you came to leave that church and some of the reasons why?
Yeah. Thanks for the question, and thanks for saying that about the culture. I appreciate that. I was proud of a lot of the work that I was able to do with that group of people. It's a lot of lovely, wonderful people, really good people. It's interesting. I mean, the community where the church is situated in many ways, culturally, it's very similar to the community I grew up in, the town I grew up in South Central Michigan, sort of a small rural community, blue collar community. And it was so fascinating and at times difficult to know. Like I'd spent all of my adult life sort of leaving communities like that, living in cities, living on the West Coast for a number of years, going to graduate school, all those things. And then to come back was it was just a whole experience. So even though it wasn't the town I grew up in, it was probably 3 hours north of there. There were just so many things that I experienced where I'm like, wow, I really never thought I would be here again, knowing that this is where I was as a kid and as a teenager. Even down to bulletin boards, growing up in my church, there are all these bulletin boards everywhere that all sorts of papers got pinned to.
Yeah.
And there was something about churches in the cities that I went to. We just didn't have bulletin boards like that. And so I remember visiting this church that I eventually became the pastor of on an interview and seeing all the bulletin boards and like having this like internal reaction of just like, what am I getting myself into? Like, this is where I've come from, and I'm not sure I'm ready to step back into it. And so there was all that internal work for me to process too. But as far as leaving, I mean, I think in some ways COVID prolonged my stay. When COVID began for us, really, March 2020, I had a sabbatical entirely planned for like 3 months from then, where my family and I were going to take the summer and go on sabbatical. And then I was pretty certain probably after that sabbatical, probably, easily within a year, I would transition out of the role. That was my sense. So I was just kind of waiting to get to that sabbatical, feeling like I could really use this time of rest and time away. And it was something that had been in my contract with the church from the beginning. So I wanted to take advantage of that. So when COVID hit, I was sort of running on fumes already. I was kind of ready to be on sabbatical, ready to consider leaving. And then, of course, that just didn't, at least to me, it seemed like it was no longer an option to leave. I was the only pastor on staff. It was an older community. And things just really dramatically changed, as everyone in ministry knows, overnight. Mm-hmm. So did that for a year. And we replanned the sabbatical that we had already planned for 2021. Ended up taking a sabbatical in 2021, which was great. But again, knew heading into it, knew coming back from it that my time at the church was coming to a close. And the way that I knew was more in terms of there was if I just think of sort of the energy in my body and how my body felt about the work at this particular church, it was just so much kind of dead energy in me. So much like, I don't think I can keep doing this. I remember even the day before I was to come back from my sabbatical, sort of laying in bed in tears, and I think saying to my wife, I'm not sure I can go back. I just don't think I can keep doing this. And I think in many ways what that was it was sort of the residual effects of enduring a significant amount of trauma over the years of being the pastor of that church. And the residual effects of just feeling like I didn't fit there anymore and having felt that way for a number of years. And just sort of a miss in my heart and my vocational calling and what I was drawn to for a number of years at that point. So it was really sort of dragging me down. And so all of that to say, I didn't really have energy for the work anymore. I wasn't excited about the present or the future. And all of that led me to believe that it was time to move on. So we kind of went through several months of a process, Wendy and I, my wife, of just trying to sort out, is this just how I'm feeling? How do we make sense of how I'm feeling? What might we do next? How do we make sense of that? And yeah, over the course of a few months, continuing to move in that direction. And at the same time, the church started to really struggle financially, sort of as we were, sort of on the cusp of coming out of COVID. Like a lot of churches, we were fewer people, there was less money. And so we were just really struggling to kind of pay the bills as a church. So all of that all together, I think it was May. So just about a year ago right now, May of 2022, I finished up and didn't have another job, didn't have anywhere to go, wasn't sure what we would do next. But that's sort of the big, broad brushstrokes of how that worked for us. Mm.
You're talking about like you just felt something in your body that was different in like I don't have the energies for this, and I'm reminded of the book that I haven't read yet, but I need to, The Body Keeps the Score, and how like our nervous system in our body is actually like keeping track of all of the things, like it's our body's brain, but we're not conscious to it in the brain in our skull, like we can't think with it, but it thinks for us in our body. And it sounds like your nervous system was just kind of going through trauma and going through, I guess like those small traumas keep adding up over and over and over again. And then all of a sudden you kind of wake up and it's like, I can't do it anymore. What am I going to do? Was that like scary? Like we're done and I don't have anything else lined up on the other side. Like what was that like to be in that in-between place?
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, very scary, terrifying, really frustrating, to not, it's like in many ways I was being invited to kind of believe and live the things that I had been asking people to live as a pastor, which is, in the world that I inhabit with God, will God provide for us? If I'm really in need of provision, what does that even mean or look like? And, how much suffering will be involved until that provision comes in a way that's satisfactory to me. So, yeah, it was scary. I spent about 6 months just sort of, I would say we spent about 6 months just sort of scraping by. I did some freelance things, and we lived in a parsonage, so we had to move out of that after a few months. And yeah, it was unenjoyable is how I would put it.
Unenjoyable. That's a polite way to say it sucked.
Yeah, totally. It seemed really good to me to be done trying to be the pastor of a church where I had just kind of lost my sense of excitement around being there. So that seemed like an important thing for me to do, to step away from that. But yeah, what I had experienced was sort of, I'm not an expert on trauma, but my understanding is just kind of a differentiation between big T trauma and little t trauma. Big T being like those incredibly traumatic experiences that we've had around death or injury or betrayal. There were some big T traumas during my time as a pastor, for sure. There was some significant betrayal from people that I trusted. There was some, threats of violence. So all of that really affected me. But in many ways, it was really just the cumulative effect of little T trauma, of people, small betrayal, small acts of betrayal, over and over and over. Lots of sort of gossip and hearing things secondhand that just sort of hurt over and over and over the years. Continually feeling like there were just relationships that were just sort of soaked or steeped in conflict. When I thought we had maybe kind of turned a corner and things would be different, they just sort of fell into the same patterns. So the cumulative effect of just those little t traumas in ministry for many, many years, I think it just really worn me down and worn me out to the point where I felt like I was completely depleted and just didn't really have anything to give anymore. And the ways in which I was able to sort of refill those wells over the years, they weren't working in the same way that they used to work. And so I found myself, burned out, really depleted, not knowing how to be filled up again, not knowing how to heal. And so I think the best thing for me and for the church was that I moved on. It's just what it meant for me and my family is that we didn't have anything to move on to. So in some ways, those little t traumas just kind of continued to accumulate, because now we had the added stress of needing income and paying bills and all of that. Even as I listen to myself talk, Tom, I'm just like, why do people get into ministry? Like, why do we do this to ourselves?
There's something different about like pastoral transition that's different than, if you're, a salesperson at a sales place and you go to a different sales place. Like,
right.
You were living in a parsonage. So moving on from the church means you lost your home. You worshiped at the church you pastored, so you lost your church community.
And my family did.
And your family did.
Yeah.
Not just you. So thanks for that reminder. Your family felt that loss of home.
Right.
Your family felt the loss of worship community, of friends. Like we are like expected to make this career path our entire world and our family's world, and yet we still have the reality of, well, I'm only going to be at this place for 5 years and then that place for 7 years. And I mean, there are those rarer cases of a pastor staying for 30 some years and retiring at one place, but those are getting a lot more rare. And so like, is there something we need to keep our eye on? Like, is there an expectation here that is not good? Like that you just have to jump into everything, and then every 5 years, your entire community and world and home and life have to be altered? Like, is there something I'm missing here, or is that just a part of the job?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's sort of a both and. I think there's a part of it that it's a part of the job, but I don't think it has to be nearly as impactful or dramatic as what we experience. I think some circumstantial things made it more difficult for us. One is that we were in a small rural community, and as a pastor, when you leave a church in a small rural community, it's just a lot harder to fold into something else, because it's a really small town. You see the people that you pastored at the grocery store when you go to buy groceries, and you run into people at the ice cream place in the summer and at the lake or whatever. So, I mean, one of the things I'm really committed to in whatever I end up doing next is I'm really uninterested in being a solo pastor again. It's like I'm not willing to do that, I think is how I would say it. I'm just not willing to do it. There might be people who really thrive in that, but I'm not one of them. So I think being able to work on a team can help make pastoral ministry more sustainable for pastors, in a way that I don't think it was very sustainable for me in a small town or in a small church. I think the other thing, we're sorting out where we're going to end up, but to a certain extent, living in more of a city or metropolitan area just creates the more choices and resources when it comes to friendships and institutional ties that can help someone in ministry weather a transition better. Most of our friends live elsewhere from where we were where our church was. We didn't easily have another church we could just attend and step into. We didn't sort of have any other connections institutionally in the community outside of our church. So when I left my role, we certainly knew other people in the church, but there just wasn't really anything to keep us tied down there and help us stay connected and feel sort of have our lives and our hearts tended to. So it seems to me that those things can happen a little more easily if you're more folded into a city or metropolitan area. But of course, that's really up to the individual and what you invest in and where you put your time and all of that. Some of the things I practice that I've written about since is the importance for pastors to have friendships outside of the church where they pastor. I think that some friendships can certainly happen with the people that you are pastoring, but there's always a power differential. And so it's not the same as sort of a friendship with people who love you and who aren't necessarily impressed by the things that you do, but who kind of see you more clearly and still want to be your friend. Pastoral relationship. And I mean, I'm open to pushback on this, but to a certain extent, it's somewhat transactional. Like, you are providing a particular kind of relationship to people for particular purposes, and they are receiving that from you. And that's really good. That's not a bad thing, but it's not a friendship. It's not the same as a friendship. There's a give and take in friendship. It's mutual rather than sort of this power differential. And so, I mean, something I had to learn to practice was developing friendships with people who didn't attend my church, and then not just developing those friendships, but maintaining them. But what it meant for me is that a lot of those friendships were just an hour or multiple hours drive away from where I live. So technology can help, but it's not the same. It's just inviting a friend over on a Saturday night and just hanging out at around a campfire in your backyard.
So now that you're kind of, I guess I would call in between pastorates, because you seem open to entering back into that world with a different perspective. But what kinds of what kinds of things have changed for you in belief about the church world, church in the West? Like, what are some of those things that have shifted in this transitional period that you've learned, or have led to the transitional period, that kind of like was, pushing you along, saying you don't belong in this period or this mindset or this community or something, either getting you there or in the midst of it? Like, what is changing in your belief about the faith in God and the community called the church?
Yeah, I mean, it's still very much in flux, very much. What has changed? I think I'm beginning to have a stronger sense of like what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, and what I can offer in my work in the world and what I can't offer in my work in the world. So in a way, like my sort of like my sense of myself and my own limitations, things I'm good at, the things I'm not good at, it's like I'm learning to just pay attention to that better, and I'm noticing it in greater detail. So I won't go into much detail, but I recently turned down a pastoral position I'd done a couple interviews for, because I realized after a couple of interviews that I'm actually not very suited for this role. I could make the most of it, and there are some really good things about it for me and my family, but I'm not particularly suited for it, nor am I excited about it. The allure of a steady paycheck and benefits was pretty significant for me. But I also know what it's like to sort of feel stuck in a role that isn't a good fit. And so I'm pretty committed to not doing that if I'm going to be in a pastoral role next. I feel pretty committed to it being a good fit for me, where I can be myself, bring who I am, certainly learn and change and grow in areas that I need to grow, but also have a pretty good handle on like, here's what I do well. And this role can let me kind of focus mostly on those things. Yeah, I mean, as far as I think the thing that feels the most in flux is how I see God in all of this. I think that's changing every week, maybe. It's just sort of always in flux. I think my sense of God walking with me is growing over the last 6 months. Even though there have been some really painful things over the last year, my sense of God walking with me is growing. My sense of God making things work in my favor is diminishing, even though I want that to be opposite. I'm not seeing, God walking with me just equating with God making things work in my favor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I'm catching that little difference in there, because towards the end of the pastorate, you were sensing that God like wasn't there, and now you're coming back in this in between time, in a time of rest, and you're finding, oh, God is here, but it's not like what I expected, where God rushes in and I'm rescued and everything's all my problems are gone and we're all good because God is here.
Right. Yeah, and so I mean, when it comes to liminality, and you know this better than I do, Tom, but it's in liminal seasons where like the deepest work can be done in our lives if we're willing to do that work. It's like the season of the desert is where like that really deep work can happen, where things are stripped away and we're sort of left with ourselves and how we make sense of the world. I mean, in theological and biblical language, it's the desert is where God does the most significant work on God's people to prepare them for the next thing. And so, this is again, you know this way better than I do, but it's the Israelites in the desert in Exodus, of losing their identity as slaves, being invited into the desert, thinking it's going to be a quick journey, but it lasts 40 years. And within 48 hours, they're complaining to Moses saying, we just want to go back to Egypt. Like things were better there than this pile of crap. And it still took 40 years for them to become the kinds of people that could inhabit the promised land. Like it took all those years to sort of break them down, and it took generationally, like they had to be changed and transformed over years. And I'm not sure they ever reached like a pinnacle or anything, but yeah, it took a long time for them to be the kinds of people that had left behind slavery, that relied upon God for provision so that they could be the sort of people that could inhabit the promised land. And so I don't know what the promised land is for, in my life, in our lives, I don't know. But I do have a strong sense that like that kind of taking away, ripping away, tearing off, breaking down, that's what's been happening to me more and more over the past year and number of months. Just sort of stripping away the things that gave me an identity and a purpose. And just trying to sort out like, what am I left with? Who am I without these things? And how do I make sense moving forward about who I am and who God is inviting me to be and become, and what kinds of spaces I'm being invited to inhabit in the world. So I'm still very much trying to make sense of all of those things. But I do think it's true that how you said, 1 to 2 years ago, I would have said all I sense is the absence of God, which is true. That's where I was for quite a long time. And now it's more like, I sense that God is with me, but I'm not sure what difference that makes yet. I really hope it makes a difference in my life. But I'm just not sure yet. So I guess that's some movement, and I'm glad for that, but I'm still not quite sure what to make of it all.
I think having too solid of an expectation of what that's going to look like is going to cause you to miss what actually is. And, we just talked about, at my church, we go through the liturgical calendar, and we went through the road to Emmaus. And here, these two disciples are walking next to Jesus, but they don't know that it's Jesus. And they're telling him their expectations, like, oh, we thought that this was the guy that was going to redeem Israel, which is just code word for, make Israel great again and make us the superpower, and all the other nations will be our slaves and servants, and all this blessing will flow in. And, they had that solid expectation. And something happened to me this week studying that passage I've never seen before. There was this transition moment for them that they're saying, we hope that this was the guy to, redeem us, redeem Israel, make us great. But then these women came and told us that Jesus was risen from the dead, and we weren't sure what to make of the testimony of these women. And Jesus uses a phrase. He says, you're foolish and slow of heart. And that phrase, slow of heart, caught my attention because I didn't know what it meant. Like, what does it even mean to be slow of heart? I know, like, slow of brain. I get that quite a bit, having food sensitivities, I eat the wrong thing and I can't think anymore. Slow of brain. But slow of heart, what does that mean? It's actually a quote from Aristotle. And he says that Aristotle said that men are slow of heart to believe in things that are against their interests. And, like, these men had a vested interest in Israel becoming great, and because they were the ones at the seats of power. And here, these women are the ones who can see what God is actually doing, because they don't have the vested interest of Israel becoming a great power like the men did. And so there they are. And so in these desert times, I think, we get the meat hooks of the institution taken out of our flesh, and we can actually say, do I actually believe these things that I've been talking about? Do I actually, I would passionately say them from the front, but do I actually believe these are true? Do they benefit? Do they work? Are they real? And that's the time when you get down, Meister Eckhart says God is found in the soul through the process of subtraction. And, in the desert, you subtract and you get down to the bare bones of, like, reality. Oh, this is who I am. Yeah. And I'm really not sure what I do believe, even though I would have never said that from the front. And so here you are in a liminal desert, and you're like, I don't know. And that's just like the best thing you could say right now.
Yeah.
So what do you think are some things in, like, Western church that you'd like to see differently, that you think are holding us down or back or detrimental? Like, what are the things that need to change, like, as we're looking at the thing in the West called the church? Like, what are you seeing from your vantage point in the desert now?
Easy question to answer, I got to tell you.
I thought so.
Two things come to mind. One is just having to do with death. There's such a resistance to death in our society. We are death averse. This is one of the reasons I love, as a pastor, I loved Ash Wednesday in the season of Lent. I would sort of, in a slightly morbid but kind of playful way, on Ash Wednesday, especially when I would talk about it leading up to the day, hey, come to our Ash Wednesday service so that I can tell you to remember that you're going to die. I mean,
yeah, it was the only time we're allowed to do that.
Right, yeah. But But it's true. I mean, everything about our life is leading to our death. Um, and we're incredibly obsessed with youth and anti-aging and young in our society. And so I think the church just has a very different way to offer our culture in general, that it's okay to be people who think about our death. And it's okay to live in light of our death, to not be afraid of death. I'm not there yet. I'm still terrified of death most days, but I think the church is sort of one of these places that helps us, that if we participate, it can allow us to remember that death is a normal part of living. And so when that comes to the church, I think this cultural value of being obsessed with avoiding death plays out in churches who are just resisting institutional death with like tooth and nail, like trying to hang on for dear life, doing whatever they can. So much stress, so much anxiety. And I think, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I just wonder what it would look like for a portion of those churches to just let death come. Like, your church had a fantastic run and probably did some amazing things to bless your community and the lives of countless people over the last 30, 40, 50, 250 years, whatever it is. It's okay to let your church die. I mean, that's okay. Your church is dying. Let's just be honest about it, and let's die with dignity and die well, and hopefully die in such a way where we can help bring about new life elsewhere, in sort of the wake of our death. Mm-hmm. So rather than resisting institutional decline and institutional death, just learn to make friends with it and befriend it and allow it to happen. See it as a gift and a normal part of living. Like, death is a normal part of life. And then the second thing, for the church, particularly in America, is that there's just a lot of uncoupling that needs to happen. There's way too much coziness between American Christianity and American political ideology, and those things need to be unwound. Right now I'm living in England, and it's so strange because the Church of England is literally an extension of the state here. The King Charles, who will coronation from the day we're recording this is in a couple of weeks, is literally the head of the Church of England. Just like the Queen was for the last 70 years, Charles is now the head of the Church of England. But there isn't, from everything I've seen here, there's just not the same level of anxiety among pastors and sort of church folks in England about the state of the church and the state of the culture here when it comes to engaging with Christianity. There's just they're not nearly as stressed out about it as so many American Christians are. It's very refreshing. Because what it does is it allows the church to be differentiated and to just be the church, rather than always living in a reactive way, rather than always feeling like we are the church in relation to what the society is doing, and reacting to society. That's what I see in so much of the American church. The church we're a part of here, they're facing all the same concerns that churches in America are, but they're just not nearly as anxious and stressed out about it. I don't know how to bring that to America, especially as just one person. Mm-hmm. But I do know how refreshing it is as an American that's lived in an incredibly stressed out church environment for all my life, to just be around a bunch of Christian people who aren't stressed out about the future of their church. It's just very refreshing. And there's sort of like a quiet hopefulness to it, a trust that God is alive and at work, and God's Spirit is alive and at work. Even if fewer people are attending our churches than they were a few years ago, there's no sense of like we've got to take our country back for God. I always hear people say things like that, and I'm just like, when did God ask you to take the country back for? When did God lose our country? I don't know. I'm just confused.
Mm-hmm.
And, I wish more American Christians could realize that that's much more about their own anxiety than it is about anything God's asking them to do. So in the same way that we're super anxious about death and we resist the reality to sort of see death as a natural part of life, we're super anxious about the decline of our churches. And what if we are able to just sort of see for what it is, grieve the loss, and let it go, and trust that there is a God that is at work in all kinds of ways that we just can't see or comprehend. And that, at the end of the day, it's all going to be okay. I just I hear people in America say things like the United States of anxiety, and that's just what it seems like America is right now, just this huge ball of anxiety, and it's coming out in all these sideways, horrible ways. So I'm not yet sure how to be a pastor back in America. I think I'm going to give it a try, and I hope I can do it better and differently than I did before, but that remains to be seen.
I'm wondering, like, if we got that superhero complex, we're always the ones who got to rush in and save the world, and we even love the superhero Marvel movies, but here, like, we're unable to actually do it. We're unable to just make the churches grow again and to make things go back to the way they were, if not even a good thing at this point, but it's like we're feeling that unableness, and so now we have adopt all this apocalyptic language. This is the end of the world, the end of the church, the end of our political party, the end of our whatever, and then that just amps up. But if we're honest, I grew up in that faith. God's about to come back, and things are going to get nasty, and it's going to be the great tribulation, and the Antichrist is going to rise, and the end of the world, and it's like that. We just grew up steeped in this stuff.
Yeah.
And now it's made tea. You're in England, tea now. And it's like, I don't know how to take the tea out of the water. It's like it's steeped. And so, this whole coming back around, is it easier to raise the dead or to birth a baby at this point? I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. That is interesting. I mean, your story is really just, I think, unique. You've gone through so much, and you're still there. Like you're still willing to give it another try. I just, so many of the pastors who've been through similar things, they just say, I'm done, and they walk away, and they go out into sales, and more power to them. That's that's what they had to do. I understand and empathize, and here you are. You're willing to say, I'm willing to give it another try. I think that's very courageous. So,
thanks.
What could you, just to kind of close this out? You've been in the liminal season, it seems like, for a long time, because you've had that sense of moving on since even before the pandemic, and then the pandemic stretched everything out. But what is one practice that has sustained you through the liminal space? It's been hard. I just acknowledge that. It's been really hard. It doesn't have to make it easier, but what is something that's kind of provided some buoyancy for your soul amongst the waters?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things come to mind. One is maybe more broadly, it's just sort of this theme of choosing to feast even though you're in the desert, intentionally finding ways to feast, to connect, to throw a party, to have good food and good wine, to go to beautiful places, to do the kinds of things in life that aren't always practical, but that provide a lot of beauty and wonder and awe. I think those are the kinds of things that have sustained me. So within that are relationships and connection, but also, I mean, very practically, good food and good coffee and good wine and I was writing a newsletter earlier today just about how awe-striking it is to be in a town that I'm in where people have been inhabiting schools for like 1,000 years. This is Oxford in England.
Wow.
And how it's just crazy because, the country that I come from isn't even 250 years old. There's a college here in Oxford called New College, as in it's the new college, and it's like 700 years old. Like that's the new college.
Wow.
The old colleges are like 1,000 to 1,100 years old.
Wow.
And so it's difficult to comprehend those big numbers, particularly as an American. But it really is fascinating, sort of awe-inspiring, wonderstruck pretty regularly. I mean, in the same ways, Oxford's just a city like any other city. I mean, it's, people commute and they have their families and their jobs and their lives. And, I walked into a McDonald's today and walked past the Starbucks. I mean, it's the same as anywhere else in the Western world. But it also has this just ridiculous history that I think in a really good way for me makes it shows me how short my life is and helps me see that there's just so much in human history that's beyond the however many years I get on this earth. And there's something about that kind of putting me in my place that is giving me a different sort of perspective on the rest of my life that's been really helpful for me. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say. Like we've taken a lot of risks as a family over the last year in a variety of ways. And we've kind of, in many ways, chosen to do some things that have just brought a lot of connection and awe and wonder into our lives. I think that's what has sustained me the most. And it's given me a picture that there is a way to have a life with God that can be full of beauty and goodness and actual awesomeness, like full of awe and wonder. I think that's what I need to feel sane. Some of that for me is just walking around in beautiful places. Some of that is, I'm going to make a chicken soup when I get off this call with you and just having really good soup. Yeah, the last thing I'll say is that it's been really important for me to find a community where I can worship in, but not be in charge of anything. And that's been really good for me to receive after spending so many years in church leadership, being the one that was in charge of everything. So we have a church here. It's been really life-giving to us. There's a seminary I'm connected to that worships together every weekday. It's been really good for me to be a part of. And just recently, I was asked to lead a couple of things with that for the first time after being here for a few months. So I led a liturgy last week in our chapel space for the first time, and that felt really good. But I certainly didn't feel like I just need to keep doing this every 7 days.
Oxford will not fall if I fail.
Right. Yeah. It's a gift to receive pastoral leadership from all kinds of people. Those are some of the practices.
Gosh, well, I appreciate you and just the journey you've been on and your honesty and the humility that you continue to learn and present to the world. And yeah, I just appreciate you. I don't know how to stop podcasts yet, so I just say I'm going to stop recording now. But thank you for being here. So here we go.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for listening to the Liminal Living podcast. If you're interested in spiritual direction to help you navigate through your dark night or deconstruction journey, please check out our website, www.liminalliving.org. We will see you next week. Blessings.